so much.
Welcome. Really good.
Yeah. You're welcome. Yours.
This is not their job, but then they don't have it. Usually they say green start. I want to thank TSC for helping me get things started this morning. Can you say that?
The TSC or TSA?
TSC. TSA is the airport. TSC is the technology solutions. Whatever. TSC is whatever.
Right? No football team, but their squash team. Of course. What about polo? I know, like
Folks, if we could start getting ourselves up to the front row, the reviewers. Here. Burke. Five. Reviewers. Uh-oh. It's off the chair in the front row, probably over there by Professor Bell. We'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the 4-day end of semester thesis reviews here at the University of Maryland. I'm Brian Kelly. I'm directing this cohort of thesis students. Tomorrow and Friday, there will be additional cohorts reviewed. Those cohorts are being directed by Professor Eric Jenkins. Before we get started, I want to make sure that everybody understands that today's reviews all day long are going to be broadcast on YouTube and Facebook so that families and loved ones back home can watch the performance of our graduate students, and so that others that might be interested in coming and studying here might get an insight as to what the end game looks like. So today we have a number of distinguished reviewers with us. I'm going to introduce the ones that are here, and then as others show up, I'll introduce them at the appropriate moment. But we have with us today Alec Deary, who's in the front row here. Alec is a partner in Grid Architects in Annapolis, right? Yeah, and Alec is an alum of the program. We have Thomas Jester over here with Quinn Evans Architects. And this is all alum. There's only one non-alum on this thing today, so this is going to be interesting. Then we have Nooni Reitig in center court here. Nooni is with Suzanne Reitig Architects, kind of some kind of relationship there between the head of the firm and the future head of the firm. And Nooni is also an alum of the program. And finally, Susan Salisbury of WDG Architects, also an alumna of the program. So welcome here today. Kristen today is going to be kicking things off. We're going to go to El Salvador. We're going to look at an alternative pattern and a set of ideals for development in El Salvador. His committee was comprised of Juan Burke, Professor Matt Bell, and myself. Also, while we are at it, you'll see these barcodes, not barcodes, QR codes posted on the wall and up on the podium. And if you want to get a copy of the program, that'll be an easy way to get a copy so you know the names and the titles and so forth. Thank you. Okay, Kristen, it's all yours. Massimiliano.
Thank you, Professor Kelly. I'd like to thank the TSSC personnel for helping me rearrange the boards, my chair, as well as my committee and the thesis cohort. All right. Colonia Maximiliano, en un barrio en El Salvador, tackles the design of a barrio in San Miguel, El Salvador, tackling issues such as affordable housing, intergenerational housing, vernacular architecture, and the theory of a barrio as as a traditional Latin American community. The design of a barrio would be equipped with affordable housing schemes, uh, tackling, as previously mentioned, traditional architecture, as well as exploring urban planning. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America with a population of 6.31 million. Um, throughout each departamento or states, each departamento has its own percentage of poverty rates, with the national level being 33.4. A lot of households constantly move in and out of poverty. It's always a instability of coming in and out and so forth. With 45 through between 45 and 55 escape poverty, but then 14 and 20 go back and fall into poverty. This causes a lot of issues in the sense that it leads to other issues such as overcrowding, substandard living conditions, um, and so forth. The theoretical portion of this thesis can be divided into the three axes, known as the plaza, the central heart of the community that generates the urban fabric, the barrio in which communities centralize around the plaza, and intergenerational housing, a solution that resolves overcrowding. The concept of the plaza is not a new idea. It was seen during indigenous times, such as in Teotihuacan, Mexico, where it was centralized around an open space. It wasn't until the Spanish introduced the laws of the Indies, which was a centralized rectangular open space that uh, emerged from a grid. This will later on define the urban edge and would become the barrio, which would each be its own community, each diverse, vibrant, and stable, containing the essentials needed to sustain the populace, such as the case in Pátzcuaro, Mexico, containing the traditional infrastructure such as schools, churches, and other essentials that will sustain the community within this area. However, the tradition of the barrio has been eroded due to gated communities. I had the privilege of visiting a gated community, uh, such as Megalopolis, which lacked the vibrancy and the sense of community uh, that a traditional barrio would utilize. It did, however, have its ups in the case of intergenerational housing, in the sense that you buy a house and then you expand upon it over time, and you can even modify it, such as in the case over here, where you can add a cover over your garage. Intergenerational housing expands uh, within the family. This is in the case of a parent or grandparent buys a house, and then over time, the children or grandchildren expand upon it, such as in the case in the image on the right, where at some point a parent or grandparent bought this portion of the house, and then the children or grandchildren expand upon it over time. A modern real-world application of intergenerational housing is Quinta Monroy by Alejandro Aravena and his team Elemento, in which Aravena provided a half-built building and the occupants later expanded upon it over time to suit their needs. The basis of my thesis is in the city of San Miguel. With in orange, you see the Centro Histórico, the historical district, where the city had expanded over the time. In purple, you see the designated bus routes, and in red, you see my proposed in the north western side of San Miguel. Zooming into my site, it's surrounded by a lot of residential infrastructures. However, there are a few essentials needed to sustain communities such as schools, markets, churches, and so on. But in this sense, it has not maintained that tradition of the barrio where everything is right there within walking reach. First, zooming into my site, we have 83 acres, majority of which is used for livestock, cattle, and we see rows of trees in a portion of the site, uh, further enhancing the notion of livestock. Here we have colored zones of the site. I do have a gated community at the very north part of my site, in which it turns it back uh, to the other residents around it, and also creates that sharp edge at the very top of my proposed site. The existing photos, there's a range of essentials such as crops, existing vegetation such as mango trees, outdoor spaces, and a lot of room for improvement in the open fields. While strolling around the neighborhoods of San Miguel, I noticed that a lot of the streets had good bones in the sense that the streets were ample width. Sidewalks had plenty of vegetation. However, there wasn't room for improvements in some areas, such as trimming some of the existing vegetation. From this, I came to my proposed master plan, which uh, integrates with the existing urban fabric, creates open green spaces, and provides essentials such as schools, churches, housing, and it also contains a diverse uh, housing typology throughout the site. Here we have all of the infrastructures within the site, such as the 1 and 2 story house, a school at the far north with a daycare right next to it, mixed use buildings occupying the surrounding area of the plaza, and then utilities in parks. The heart of Colonia Maximiliano is the plaza, surrounded by mixed use buildings with with arcades decorating the edge of the plaza. Uh, Something that you will notice is that there is a huge contour gradient with a 4 meter difference. And how I tackled this was by playing around with the contours, in which I stepped my buildings to accommodate that height difference, as well as the plaza also gradually uh, deteriorating down as the slope goes. Uh, to create a sense of community around the plaza, as the essential infrastructures needed were implicated, such as in the case of mixed use, creating activity around the plaza to allow circulation, street markets, and a sense of that central openness of being around and within the plaza. As I mentioned, there's also an academic school at the far north, where you also have that within walking radius of the plaza. Going into the building typologies for type 1, I provide a base of the house, and you have ample room of backyard where you can expand over time. That goes into the intergenerational housing, and this could be done through phases as time goes on. Same can be said with the two-story house. Again, you have ample space on the sides and the back, and where you expand over time, and how it's seen in elevation through the house type 1. Both house types are dispersed throughout the whole master plan. Uh, so each block contains both housing types. And to get a sense of that intergenerational housing, I took the first house type at its base, and over time what it could potentially look like, yeah, as expand upon it vertically, adding a balcony, or just completely integrating the house within the site. Overall, the creation of this master plan is it not only integrates to the urban fabric, but also provides the essentials of a traditional body, such as schools, churches, and other infrastructures, provides a center that is both geographical and socially placed, and is dispersed with diverse building typology. I'd like to thank all of you for my presentation, and I would like to open for questions.
Thank you, Kristen. And I'm going to pass the microphone. And for those of you, it's important we talk into the microphone. Right now, the building's very quiet. But as the day progresses, the building will get full of people. This environment is the classroom. A lot of times people up there don't realize it and they'll get talking. So the more noise we make, the more we command the space. And you just commanded the space very well, Kristen. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I commend your use of different densities and mixing them all up. One question I have for you is your parking strategy. Something I think that is really successful here is all this green space and bringing the outdoors to all of these modest units. How did you decide with the parking, like street parking versus parking that you drive into, like a very typical suburban method? Yeah, can you get into that?
Do you want to go into commercial first and then go to residential, or how do you?
Everything,
Okay,
but
everything?
I would, yeah, focus on the residential since that's the majority.
Okay. In the residential, I would add that the streets are 8 meters. That's essential for 2 lanes of traffic flow. Not many people in El Salvador own a car. They mostly own motorcycles or like mopeds. That's one thing because they're much cheaper to buy. In the sense of parking, each house has its own designated parking spot integrated within the layout of the house. If there is a visitor, let's say, and they come in, they want to visit a family member or a friend, they can park in the street, but it would be like a designated time zone, like you park here at this time or on this day on a weekend, and that's for the residential. Commercial parking. First off, I did not want parking in the front of the plaza or around the plaza because that takes away from the user experience. I wanted the parking to be out of view, out of reach. Well, out of view, yes. where I positioned the parking, uh, they were situated where I wanted it to be ground level parking. Um, and where I, like, let's say for, because I'm looking at the plan as well, it's talking about this. Um, towards the, so these were essentials because where the original plan was, there wasn't a lot of vegetation. So that was a no-brainer to add parking there. However, these areas right here consisted of a lot of vegetation that I wanted to preserve. So that inspired the location of parking. For the school and the daycare, that would be underground parking. Um,
Mhm. When you talk about the importance of the car and that it is not the typical,
Mm.
I would, consider and reconsider giving the car such importance and having it affect the design of the housing and the street
Mm.
um, in the project.
I'm just going to do really quickly. Just wanted to introduce two people that have just joined us. Chris Elcock of GWWO Architects is here today. Thank you for coming. Thank you for dealing with our wonderful traffic around here. Hopefully you didn't drive on University Boulevard. And then Adam Bresnik, who's the key distinguished professor, also alum of the program, is here. When do you head back to Spain? At the end of the month. His home is in Spain. So the guys that brought us the laws of the Indies.
So I'm going to pick up a little bit on the thought that Nooni had and take it in a little bit of a different direction and ask you to talk a little bit more about your site selection. Because I admire everything that you've done, and I love that you're taking the aspects of the barrio that that can be nurtured and beneficial, and finding a way to grow those. But I would have loved to see you select a site that actually was closer to the bus lines. You'll hear a lot of conversation about transit-oriented development, and this would have been a great opportunity to explore that, particularly if cars aren't supposed to be central to your design. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you selected this site, and whether this community then on the outskirts has the population to support the amenities that you've designed. So is there enough population to fill this school and support these businesses that you've designed?
yeah. Um, I would like to say that there's always room for housing because uh, no one can afford it. Well, a few can afford it, and those who can't, they build just anywhere, like the squatters. They just build wherever. Um, this to accommodate the commercial, the school. Um, the population is always growing. Um, and there's always development. In the case of where I chose my site, there's actually a portion of it that's already being developed right now, a little bit further down of my site. Um, that really doesn't answer your question, though. Do you want to?
What Christian didn't say in the presentation was that a lot of this city is growing in American-style low-density sprawl. And I think that's true. They have their own flavor of it there, but that's sort of what's happening. So I think the idea was to sort of provide a different model. The thing about the buses is that, in my experience, when you plan something like this, the municipality looks at existing bus routes and says, well, how do we change them to service this community? So I think you wouldn't expect that the bus lines wouldn't change. You would say, well, there's more people living here, so we're going to have to service it in a different way. And you certainly can imagine a lot of different ways buses could come in and out of this community here. Maybe, Christian, to talk a little bit about, you didn't talk too much about your housing types. here. You might want to point out a little bit of what you designed and, you know, what your thoughts were about the expandability and the specifics of these things, which are in front of me. That's why I'm looking at them there.
I'm going to move over here. So to start off, when I visited El Salvador, I was staying at my dad's house. I noticed that there was a lot of bioclimatic strategies implemented into the houses. This was built like way back when, before, you know, technology. Um, but I liked how uh, as soon as you open the doors or even windows, a gust of air would go in, and that was one inspiration of why I wanted that to be implemented into each house. Um, there also was a lot of greenery around where I was staying. So that sense of nature was also inspiration of why I wanted to enhance the vegetation for not only the houses, but overall the master plan. Um, in the sense of um, in the sense of the expanding portion, that's already in that I want to say concept, but that's already integrated into Latin American culture. It's always been there for many, many years. So I needed to design a model or two models in this case that could potentially, you know, expand over time. And that's why there's ample room in the backyard for that expansion.
Is it typical that they would park the car on the lot? Is that typically a cultural
Yes,
thing?
yes. They usually just cover it up with like the way how I have it. Yeah. Yeah, with the gate. Yeah. I think he wanted the mic.
I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting things going on here. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to stay on the housing thing for now, since Matt took us there. I mean, I think I really commend the thoughts about this, and I think the ones where, like the upper left drawing, where you have kind of phase 2, phase 3 happening behind, almost creating like a courtyard, and using the walls as like the landing spots for those make a lot of sense to me. And the bottom ones where you kind of phase to the right, phase to the left, that also makes sense. I think the way you describe the vertical expansion is a little bit troubling. You know, you built when you build a roof on a house, and then you can't just take the roof and push it up. So you're basically like taking the whole roof off. No one can live there, and you're building up from there. So I think that the thing about the Aravena examples is that there's this kind of framework for where the expansion goes that perhaps lets the person continue to live in the house that they're in. So I think that is a little, it just isn't as clean as the other ones where you're like accepting that they might fill in more of the lot. So I particularly like that upper one with that kind of creates this like courtyard situation. And then I just like in terms of, you were talking about the parking strategies. One of the things I think the courtyard, the central plaza, like there's some things about that are really elegant. I love the like stepping of the buildings. I love how I'm looking at this section on the bottom where the last building becomes 3 stories. There's like something very like, I don't know, something very playful about that. It's beautiful. The kind of simplicity of the facades, it really, I believe it. But then as you were talking about, well, I want to push the cars out of the plaza and I don't want to have parking, but then there's a million cars in your drawings. And the problem is if you have 2 lanes of traffic and you have no parking, people are just whipping around this thing, you know? So I think there's ways, I think you could allow parking in the courtyard and make a better space by forcing people to slow down. So I think that kind of the kind of street traffic development of that courtyard could be a lot better. Or you just don't let, you know, maybe cars can't go around the whole thing. They can only go through 2 sides of it or something.
Mhm. Right. Right. Yeah.
I'm going to ask two questions related to that. So one is, and we were talking a little about like how many people can support the school and the daycare. So one of the questions is, and maybe you said at the beginning, is how many people were you trying to support? And then the second part kind of related to where it is. I mean, certainly you could have theorized added bus lines or whatever, but the other thought I had is, did you ever consider the possibility of like puncturing this gated community and like making part of your intervention kind of a critique of that?
I like how you mentioned that, because that was a great question. I did puncture a portion of the wall, because this is a wall right here. I punctured it so the residents in this gated community can have a direct access to everything going on in the plaza. So I like how you mentioned that. Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. But what about the density? How many people were you trying to put on this site? How did that look?
So the density number around my
Families.
over 640. Yeah. Each individual house. I know it in acres. It's 83 acres. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if you have 600 families, then if you assume 2 kids, 1,200 kids divide between elementary, middle, and high school, you're looking at, say, 400 kids, which would be, in America, the size for elementary school. Eventually, imagine that it could also be built space.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of pick up on what Alec was saying about the kind of what connects to the larger area. And I think there's some areas where you really successfully kind of knit this community back to existing elements. And I really appreciate that. Kind of curious, question about whether you talked about the vernacular forms and how kind of bioclimatic approach to that. Did you think about that for the larger site? So your sun and wind diagram, just kind of how it may have informed decisions about massing and, creating shade, so on. I mean, I realize they're relatively low buildings, but did you think about that? And then I also kind of wonder, I also agree with Alex, I think it's really nice to have this kind of variety in the buildings that frame the plaza. I wonder if there's maybe an opportunity somewhere to kind of puncture that and have a, pass through, like another kind of way to get into the plaza. I think about a place like in Georgetown, if you've ever been to Katie's Alley, there's a way to come off M Street and just kind of go, it's like a secret passage back into the other area. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of curious about that.
Could you repeat the question?
Well, the first one was about whether the kind of your sustainability approach was applied to the larger site and the placement of buildings and the massing, not just the how you looked at the specific
To the house, right?
housing typologies.
To answer that, it influenced the layout of the roofs itself, with a lot of them being what's it called, gable roofs. So that would influence where solar panels would go. Yes to the solar, but wind, not so much, because there is like a slight shift in orientation of some of the mixed use. Your second question was?
I think it was whether there might have been opportunities to kind of puncture the
Yeah.
some of those volumes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Christian, kudos to you for picking up a lot of stuff we threw at you in the last several weeks of the thesis, particularly this drawing here, which is the first time I'm seeing it, but I'm very happy to see it because it previously, you should know, for that drawing, he had just the blow up of the illustrative plan, and we said to him, wait a minute, if you're going to go to a larger scale, you need to account for more stuff.
Mm.
And so he did that, and much to your credit, I think it's showing the arcade and the ways through and where some of the cores would be and the stairs, even though you haven't designed all those buildings. It does show a level of thought of the impact of the urban form on the building types and how you use them. And I think that's really great, I have to say. I admire this project because of its kind of episodic quality at one level. The square has a kind of very clear diagram to it, but yet the section gives us some episodes here where we might get a 3-story piece, or we might have an arcade that might slope and things like that in it. And I think it's always interesting to sort of confront these ideal forms with very specific topographic conditions there, which is, I think, what you've done. I mean, there could have been different ways you could have done this. I mean, one level, you could have made the square all on one level because the sloping, it might present some problems with some way of terracing up to it there on the one street so that it didn't have a lot of slope in the square. But there may be reasons why the slope in the square might be a good thing too, from a kind of use point of view. It might have suggested a slightly different configuration of the pathways and the fountains and things, given the recognition of that topo in the square itself. I think also as well, what I also admire is your decision to put this square in the center of these two neighborhoods the way you did. And the idea that somehow this gated community up to the north is going to be part of this someday when it's no longer gated, and that your street grid does a reasonable job of aligning some connections there where one could see that happening on a better day in the future. Because, I think El Salvador is a place that's plagued by crime, and gated communities are not that unusual because of the situation there in terms of the crime rate in some of these neighborhoods. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily always going to be gated. I think the building types also work reasonably well. I share Alex's concern about the 2-story addition there. Did people move out? Do they stay there while that's going on? It's always a tricky thing. The one I think is really successful is when you expand it to the courtyard there, and you use the courtyard type to make a kind of simple pavilion into something now that has a kind of spatial center of the house. I sort of wish you had drawn the final phase of that, showing how that courtyard would become an outdoor living space, so that the thing would transform from being more or less conventional house into something that has a courtyard topology, which I think probably has some resonance in the culture down there as well. The last thing, two other comments I want to make is, I really feel in some of these drawings that I'm there because of the way you draw the vegetation. And I greatly appreciate that drawing up there, where I can only assume, I've never been to El Salvador, but I can only assume that those species of trees are what one would expect. What are they?
Translation: rosary trumpet tree. They're they they're deciduous trees that bloom in like early January through February.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do they provide a canopy all year round?
Yes.
So that's really important, because part of the thing there is that the sun is pretty intense, and providing a canopy in this public space probably makes the space usable more time of the year. But I really like the ones where they include this one. I know you kind of shaded them out so you could see the space there, but I can imagine in some of these it's starting to tell me more about how I would experience this space and walk under the natural vegetation, so that the space is a place I could enjoy in January and in July, which I think is really crucial to the thesis. The last thing I would say is I also admire the simplicity of the architecture around the square. Lots of times, you hear people say things like, well, I wanted to break up the massing, or, the architecture could do more and things like that. In actual fact, there is a beauty in repetition. And I think there's a beauty in repetition here for me aesthetically, but also because I think it makes the building simpler to make. And I think you're probably looking at a reasonably modest construction culture in El Salvador. These would be concrete buildings, is that right?
Yes. Concrete reinforced concrete columns.
Right, with stucco on
Yep,
the outside.
stucco
So I
and then
think
paint.
the way in which he's sort of embraced that as a technology and that the people there could build that, I could imagine relatively easily, wouldn't be so far outside their capabilities. Well, I appreciate greatly. And the idea of the simplicity, I think, helps that. I think maybe some of the proportions could be studied a little bit more. The windows on that seem a little bit big to me there. You don't give us a whole lot of information about where else the tradition, you could learn from the traditional architecture that tells you about the size of windows, or I might not have the horizontal windows there. I probably would try and study those proportions a little bit more to make sure I understand it. But I have to really hand it to you. This thing came a long way in the last month, and I think the elaboration of that as an idea and the pictures that go with it, I think are set you up to be a terrific real estate entrepreneur in El Salvador. Selling the square and the livability of this whole community.
Thanks, Matt. I totally agree with Matt. I think that this is a really successful urban concept for the urban design, especially the shading, the trees, how to enable people to live outside. And you were really looking into those concepts for the housing, but I think that you really need to look into the housing, and the housing falls short in that department because these units are, the footprint of these houses are what, like 500, 600 square feet?
The house.
Mhm.
Hold on, I'm doing.
Is it like 25 by 25 feet, something like that?
23.
Okay, so you're dealing with these very modest footprints, and you have, these, it requires the maximum of efficient design to get the cross ventilation, all of the things that will, give the people that live there the increased quality of life. And when you look at the floor plans, you see that like you're giving the smallest amount of space for the living room. That's like a 9-foot wide living room, maybe smaller. So it's like now is your opportunity to get into the details, to really look at that, to see the ones that have the car kind of driving into the house. How can you maximize the footprint of the building and not waste the space? And then the floors that have the bedrooms. The bedrooms don't have to be as big as, suburban American bedrooms in such a small footprint. And when you have such a small footprint, it may be a good idea to kind of look into also like more flexible, open plans that don't necessarily put up partitions to block the cross ventilation. And then when you have things like corners, to always take advantage of windows on both sides to enable the cross ventilation. So just to get into the details, but this is a very ambitious thesis, and it's multiple theses in one.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, is the upper level above your retail, is that meant to be residential? Is that
Yes,
apartments
yes,
basically?
yes.
Because I think that's actually part of your story also. That's another way to address intergenerational housing. It's not necessarily on the same lot, but the proximity to the houses themselves, it's another way to solve that problem. So you have probably both younger and older people living in the apartment setting,
Yeah.
but they're very near to, the rest of their family. And so if you were going to fill this out a little more, seeing some of the apartments developed would be an interesting way to take it one step further.
Just to pick up on what you were talking about, kind of the housing, and I think all of it. I mean, I think the one thing that this thesis is missing in terms of how you gave it to us is the kind of precedent or the examples of like the context. As you talked about vernacular architecture, like one of the first sentences you said, and yet we see none of it. So I think that would be like to see how that influenced you or didn't, or the kind of, you talked even about the kind of the way that that your father's house works from a sustainability standpoint, like understanding how that works, and then you could potentially react specifically to what Nooney's talking about and say, like, this is how we did it, and or not, So I think that's a missing piece, and I think you have like a little bit of space where you could just put up a bunch of beautiful pictures of buildings that you photographed or that you found, and those things, then you can see the kind of thread throughout the project.
I would just echo that. I think you mentioned earlier that there was some part of the plan where you mentioned there was no vegetation. Did you retain any of the existing vegetation as part of the plan?
So to answer, yes. In this area as well as this portion right here, this was already in existence, a soccer field. So that had to be reorientated. Some of the vegetation did go away from there, but those areas that I did point out earlier, those were existing. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit. And I would also just echo what Susan said about maybe the opportunity to incorporate more housing in the square. I mean, when I look at the perspectives, I kind of think maybe even a third story and some of that might help better define give a little more emphasis to the square itself. But I think it's partly because of you suppress the vegetation, but I still think it might be. And again, I still think that the variety of the stepping is a really nice element, but I could almost just take that whole thing and move it up a full story, and it probably would still work pretty successfully.
Mm.
All right, you're up, Juan.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Juan Burke. I'm the chair of this project. So they say that thesis is, it's a commonplace to say that thesis involves personal journey, but that is certainly the case with Christian, who is American, Salvadoran American, had been to El Salvador maybe when he was a child and then
Twice,
returned.
yeah.
Right. And then came back to El Salvador with his dad to sort of visit the land of his ancestors, of his family. So it was really interesting to work with you, Christian, for that reason and many others, trying to also unlearn some of the American urban planning strategies, such as car-centered design and different ways of constructing, different ways of living, and the nature of the barrio, which is still very much ingrained in Latin American culture, but it's not as strong as it used to be a few generations ago. So Christian worked really hard. I have to say that. I have to recognize that. We threw a lot of stuff at him, as Matt was saying, and he always responded. So I'm really proud of you, Christian, and thank you for letting me work with you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Sorry. Thank you, Kristen. Great job. We're going to turn and face this wall. We have a break of about 5 minutes if you need to get coffee, pastries, use the restroom. At the top of the hour, we're going to restart right here. Sorry, Kristen. I see. Now I see what's going on. Now I see why it's there. Now I see why it's here. Because you're going to put it together. Yeah. Never mind. We'll leave it right there. We talked about it, don't we? Yeah, yeah. It's fine. Okay. How are you doing? Doing good. Good to have you. How are you today? Did a good job. Did a really good job. So I don't know if you saw that there, as part of the working three, could be our create or production.
You want to yeah. I feel like it's better to point. Yeah.
I had to ramp up my involvement. So it's just in a process.
Next one? Next one. Oh, wow. I heard it was like on the broad. My goodness. We're going to get started in about 3 minutes. So the north actually is pointing that way, right? Is that correct? Yeah. I'm sure that is correct. Yeah. Okay. One minute. So welcome to the second of 3 presentations this morning. In the prior presentation, Christian, AKA Massimiliano, worked with a greenfield site and created a town square and a community around and on that greenfield site. And we're going to see kind of different strategy at play here in Sergio's thesis, which is to work within the context of an existing barrio with a kind of circumstantial fledgling town square and help to give some definition and clarity to what that urban space might be. So Sergio will be presenting. We're going to go to Buenos Aires for this. His chair was Michael Abrams. Other committee member was Joseph Williams, and myself. Sergio, take us away.
Hello, I'm Sergio Gomez, and like Professor Kelly was saying, we're going to be moving a little further south from El Salvador to Buenos Aires now. So this is the thesis, reinforcing the villas, supporting Buenos Aires informal settlements. So looking at informal settlements globally, a large majority of them are located in South America, Africa, as well as East Asia, and they're growing every single year. And by 2050, it's projected that half of the urban population are going to be living in some sort of informal settlement. So zooming into Buenos Aires itself, we could see here in these maps that people that are least likely to have a high school degree, also unemployment, as well as the average income, are all concentrated in the southern portion here in Buenos Aires, as well as having the largest majority of informal settlements located in them. And that's a district called Comuna Ocho, which I'll get into a little further. So historically, Argentina's seen informal settlements as an eyesore and something that should be bulldozed. Specifically in 1976 and 1983, during the dictatorship of that time, where there was a slum eradication plan, which issued to evict and demolish a large majority of these informal settlements to make space for new real estate development, as well as to beautify the image of the country during that World Cup the following 2 years. And in just a span of 2 years, over 100,000 people were displaced because of this eradication plan. So the question is, how can community buildings and urban spaces support informal settlements in Buenos Aires, connecting them into the existing urban fabric and enhancing people's lives? So today, Argentina's perspective on informal settlements has changed, and they've recognized them, and they've now started to support them to help integrate them socially, economically, as well as urbanly. So going back to Comuna Ocho. Comuna Ocho is made up of 3 neighborhoods: Via Soldati, Via Lugano, and Via Richello, and is considered a sports district because of the large span of green space. So Comuna Ocho has a population of 200,000, with the average age of being 24, which is starkly different from the rest of the population in Buenos Aires that has a population of 34. Like I said previously, out of the 200,000, only a quarter of them have a secondary degree. And this district itself is a district of families. 88% of the households are a family household, and 62% of the households have a child in that household. So zooming into Via Soldati, where Barrio Fatima, the informal settlement, is located, we see that there's a professional soccer stadium north of it. We have the informal settlement itself located here in the center. We have a flood retention lake just south of it, as well as 2 parks, Parque Indoamericano, which is a very vast space that has basketball courts and soccer fields. The second park is Parque de la Ciudad, which is a rundown amusement park. And then the 2018 Youth Olympics Village was actually located here to help increase that sports district zoning. And then finally, a golf course at the very south end. Really just emphasizing the fact that this is a very sports-heavy area, but there's no access to that sports for these people in the informal settlements. So looking at the block specifically that's going to be studied, we can see that the figure ground shows that the buildings themselves are very tightly packed together with very narrow alleyways, some being as wide as only 3 feet. That all floods into this central white space here, which is the space that also does not have any homes. It's a very civic, it's a very public space with a concrete soccer field, a daycare center, an open galpon, which is a shed, or not a shed, but an open canopy area, and then a church at the end. So looking at these site photos, we can see that there is a culture in this neighborhood, right? They have a neighborhood church, they have a street market or a feria that happens every weekend, and they have their own small community library here with a lot of books that they're starting to bind on its own weight. So when looking at Buenos Aires and its urban plan, it's very important to note that many believe that Buenos Aires is a very European city. It's a European city in South America, right? I think we all know of La Plata here, which is definitely not the law of the Indies, but it's a very urbanly designed city. And that we can see that there's a tale of two urban plans, the very European influence one and the informal settlement influence, with the European influence being reflective of the European immigration at that time. And then for the informal, it's a reflection of that economics and politics of Argentina during its many periods. So the two urban precedents that were looked at were the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, Spain, as well as a plaza in Barcelona, which was the old Cardo Decumanes of that area. And we can see that in Plaza Mayor, it originally started as a medieval plan, but the measures that were took were to subtract as well as add a loggia at the front to create shop openings and increase space here for economic growth. And then for the plaza here, we can see that these buildings are not in a very rigid square, but what they did was that they implemented a floor, a pavement that helps formalize that. Which brings me to the site design, which takes this very jagged, open niches here and helps formalize that space by using subtractive and additive measures. So going here, I now want to shift over to the model. So if the jury doesn't mind to stand up. So this right here is the existing layout right here with the galpon here, the church being on this corner, a daycare, and a small single-story room that's connected to the galpon. So the first step is to remove these. So these are homes. Yeah, those are just homes. Yeah. Yeah, not just. Yeah. So removing that, and then also. So removing those, and then taking this galpon and placing it here so that it creates a gateway into that plaza. The second step would be to then take the newly programmed plaza and to slip that. Thank you. Yeah, it's very hard to do with one hand. But so newly formalized plaza, which has market stands here that also work as stands for the soccer field, a soccer field here, and a playground space that has a tree-lined path on both ends. From there, we then add a loggia on both ends, which creates over 9,000 square feet of addition for the informal settlements here, as well as one on this side here, just to help formalize that space more. And then the final step is to then take the community center and place it here so it caps that plaza space. So with that, I'm gonna now shift over back to the yeah. So now going into that plaza space, this is the entrance of the galpon here, shown there, which is a space where there's able to have temporary or newly budding businesses where the people could sell clothes, they could sell toys. Moving past that galpon area, we now see these market stands, which have a more permanent area where people are able to sell food out of, and also have a space to gather. Moving further up, we see the field, and we can see this before and after. This shows the previous concrete hardscape field to the newly added grass field, as well as the loggia that's in the background that helps formalize that space, as well as giving addition to the informal settlement. Looking at this playground, which is location of where the daycare center is, which is gated and walled up, and instead it's now opened up, and that daycare is now integrated into this loggia space, so it's not entirely removed. And then getting to the very end of the street, we see that the community center and this church have a very deep connection with one another. So moving to the building precedent, I like that the vertical gym in Caracas, Venezuela. This is one of three that's been implemented in Venezuela. Their primary site in these projects are informal settlements in Venezuela. And these are to help introduce sports, specifically sports facilities in a place that's very tightly packed and doesn't have that space. And what I thought was really interesting about this president was the amount of the program they were able to add in this building. So taking that program and implementing it into a space that already has some sort of space compared to in Venezuela, which takes us to the building. The main roof structure takes precedent from the galpon space here, which creates a nice truss system on the third floor. So going to the entrance of the community center, this is from the plaza space. That loggia creates a gateway or a threshold between that playground space into the community building. Going into the ground floor, we see that it's very open and there's a triple height space in the middle. This floor specifically has a gymnasium so that people could really increase or can grow in their physical features. Moving to the second floor, this is where people are able to build careers with a career center as well as a career studio so that people could learn how to wood shop or do carpentry and things of that sort. The second floor also has access to that elevated deck area, which serves as an observation deck that looks out to the plaza from the building out to the galpon. And then the third floor shows this truss system, which is a double height space all the way through that's completely open so that people are able to see that truss system from one end of the building to the other end. So weaving formal urban strategies with existing informal settlements helps integrate the community with the rest of the city, but also enhances the people's lives because it reinforces the community that's already there and present. Thank you.
Thank you. I was expecting at some point to have you talking about the tenants are whisked along corridors on conveyor belts, past murals depicting Mediterranean scenes, the last 7 quarters. Right. It was very nice. It was a very nice little assembly of things. We'll have to share with you the Monty Python architect sketch if you've never seen it. It's absolutely hilarious. Anyhow, folks, jump in here.
Talk a little bit about the language. Can you talk a little bit about how you derive the language of the architecture here?
So the language of the architecture, I really studied the Plaza Mayor and how they implemented their repetition of bays. So taking that as well as the Spanish influence that's located in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to really help inform setting the base for the loggia, the traditional brick on the second floor, and dormers on the roof.
So that's something you do find in Buenos Aires.
Yes.
It's common in Buenos Aires. It doesn't seem to be common in the barrio.
No, yeah. So the barrios are very much
Flat roofs.
yeah, flat roofs, just straight. I mean, I guess all buildings are straight walls, right? But yeah, flat roofs.
So I'm glad you pointed that out because my initial reaction, I love the community aspect that you've built and the amenities that you've provided. But I was a little bit troubled by the expression around the plaza. I wish there had been a way to allow the character of the barrio to be expressed in that facade. If this is meant for these people, I'm a little troubled by covering them up with something that looks different than what they developed naturally on their own. But I appreciate that it is an expression that is relevant to Buenos Aires, which I didn't realize until that was pointed out. So thank you.
Sergio, as your chair, I know you traveled to Buenos Aires and you talked to the people. Can you talk to the jury about your trip over there and the folks you met down there?
Yeah, so my trip was really nice. So I have family down there, so I was able to go there, and I also got in contact with a couple community members in the barrio. One of which actually being the president of the barrio, or the spokeswoman for the barrio. And so yeah, her vision and goal for the barrio is to really like elevate it and formalize it. And like for many of these spaces, her son was saying that he wants in these alleyways those stringed lights that you see in in DC and many other areas. So they definitely want this more like formalized space.
So just to be clear, culturally, the average population views the Spanish colonial model as still something to aspire to.
Yes.
Okay, I think that was important. And one other question, the Galpon, was that there before, or is that part of the new intervention in your plan?
Yeah, so
I wasn't sure.
currently it is currently there, yes.
It's currently there.
Yeah, currently there.
Okay, so that geometry and that roof was there, and you're
Mhm.
borrowing from that then to sort of house the other anchor.
Yes.
Thanks. I want to commend you on all your graphics and the way that you tell the story of your thesis. I think that like the big move here is creating a way for people to live outside. And I love the way that you kind of bring in the neighborhood into your project, and you create all these spaces to experience the site differently outside, whether shaded or in the sun. And then also with the architectural styles, I like the way how you mix the styles. You mix the, I was wondering, like, aesthetically, was it from the squatter housing of the concrete structure with the brick infill? Or
Yes.
what, or was it the architecture building?
So yeah, it's very nice that you picked up on that. Is that yeah? So many of these homes, they're concrete framed with brick infill,
Mhm.
and it's for a lot of them they're like that because their works in progress, right?
Right.
So people are waiting to earn enough income to then get stucco to then stucco the building, but it creates this nice language of like a nice frame of that concrete, like you said.
Yeah, and
with
this
the
is
brick
like,
infill.
this is the style that you see all over the world. And you see the structures continuing with the rebar
Yes.
antennas. But yeah, mixing that with this kind of like neoclassical, I think was kind of poetic, and I like the idea of it. I think what I would want to see done further is to give the same attention that you did to the built space as the green space, because the success of buildings is really what is in between them and the nature. And opportunities that I see here that could be taken further is to do like a way to incorporate shade into the stands, you know, and you could do like an artistic intervention, or like a continuation of this canopy. I don't know how it would be resolved, but some way to incorporate shade into these spaces, also to incorporate shade into the playground, you know, like instead of having a playground that is just like components taken and planted there, to really, you know, do the architecture of the space outside. And yeah. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Good morning. I'm going to take a different tack. So I think it's a really fascinating site and really well explained the regional sort of development of the Comuna Ocho. I do think there's a leap in scale, which you don't really explain how we went from that whole sector to this particular site, even though it seems obvious because there is some urban amenities already on site, but you didn't really explain how you got there. So that to me is a bit strange, and especially and all, since yesterday, I find it odd that some information is not on the boards. So like that plan of like Buenos Aires, that's not on the wall, to me is confusing because it's hard for us to understand. So I want to make that point. Second of all, to me, there's some scalar issues that really kind of worry me. And I do appreciate the repurposing of the galpon, because the galpon, as I understand it, is an outdoor play space on a rainy day, and is typical all over the world. And then I love the idea of the vertical gym, but I would, and I like the fact that you've picked on the galpon for its structure, et cetera, but I think you should look at Lina Bobardi and look at the Ses Pompea as a way of using the language that's more related to, dare I say, poverty, or dare I say, informal architecture. And I think that would be, and I think you are doing that in some ways, but then you completely shove off to the side and ignore the church. And the church is a incredibly important element in Hispanic culture. And it's just, this residual piece on the side. You could have made the entrance to your building next to the church. You could have created some sort of relationship. In fact, before I realized it was a pre-existing building, I thought, why don't you just turn the entrance and you enter from the side where you have a plaza, et cetera, but then I realized it's a pre-existing building. So there's some oddity there. In fact, you're not even drawing a double wall in the floor plan. The church wall is the wall of the vertical gym. I'm gonna continue, I'm sorry. Why symmetry? So why do we have this symmetrical space? I mean, I live in Madrid. One of my best friends from Princeton wrote the definitive book on the Plaza Mayor, Jesus Escobar. Know the Plaza Mayor like the back of my hand. Find it extremely odd, especially after the semester we've taught a post-colonial graduate study on, how do you build in a post-colonial culture. Buenos Aires is based on Paris. It's not based on Madrid. It's based on Paris. It's a Parisian city. It's not a Madrid city. This looks to me like the University of Maryland. To me, that's just freaky. And I'm sorry, I'm going to use that word. So this architectural language I find extremely odd. The Plaza Mayor is Habsburg, and slate roofs make no sense in Madrid because they're coming from, Germany and from Austria, and therefore snowy climates. And I mean, they make no sense in Madrid. And that's something when you get to Madrid, you're like, why do we have slate roofs? So the fact that you're translating that architecture, which makes no sense in Madrid, it does historically, but not architecturally, and you're translating it to the site, really kind of makes me nervous. There is a wonderful opportunity. So I think all of your instincts are so are so perfect in that, the way you enter, the way you use the galpon, the way you locate the community center, all the programmatic moves, but there's some architectural issues which I think you really should reconsider. And I know that's not the general tone of these reviews, but I really feel like it's important for you to understand that.
So I don't think you're suggesting that because this is a barrio and because it is a place where underprivileged people live, that they should have underprivileged architecture. Okay. But I think this brings up to me a problem with architectural education. All these appropriations that take place in architectural education, or in architecture, in reality, where the Habsburgs create a square in Madrid, or French plan is overlaid in Buenos Aires. In the teaching of architecture, taking and transforming architecture is verboten. We are very lame at how we, as faculty members, teach students to look at the things we love in the door and then work with them to abstract on them and to create something that is a kind of middle ground between that. And I agree with you. I mean, I think seeing the Habsburg thing here is for me a bit much. And we just, we either say you can't look at it because it's part of a zeitgeist that no longer exists, which is bullshit. Or we say, you know, it's not about creativity, and it is about creativity, and it is about the many zeitgeists that do exist. So I think I agree that that would be something that we would want to explore further. I'm passing this to Tom.
I just want to kind of echo what you said. I think that our work always begins by trying to understand the existing place deeply, and both, you know, the architecture, the context, the site, the city, whatever it is. And I do think you can abstract elements and kind of make something contemporary and still have to be very much related to the existing community in which you're working. I'm just want to go back to one other point that Nuni made about the Galpon. I think it was a strong move to retain it, place it where you did. I'm a little troubled by the kind of the promenade coming in and being faced with the bleachers. It feels a little bit like a missed opportunity to have kind of some version of compression released into this new space you've created. And then, but I think I have a solution. I would actually flip the two elements in the plaza, because I think you could use because I'm looking at the kind of the colonnade and being able to occupy that second story. I wonder was that could be part of the bleachers, being able to look down on the soccer field or the sports court. So I was kind of, and that part feels a little bit unresolved. On one end, it's kind of, you access it via a stair. The other end just kind of stops and isn't really connected back. So I think there was just an opportunity there to better integrate that into the.
Hi, Sergio.
Hey, Professor Bell.
I really like your project. I don't think it's perfect, but I really like the boldness of it. And I was making a list sitting here. Yeah, okay, we could probably quibble a little bit with stylistic things, but things do get imported from place to place. You know, the Place de Vosges is an Italian Renaissance square plunked down in the middle of Paris. The Palazzo Farnese arrived in Rome as a Florentine palace. And we all know how provincial the Italians are. You know, take that Florentine thing out of here. That's not Roman. So I think I'm sort of along with Brian's point of view about understanding the relationship between the transformation of something and its final resting place is kind of an interesting dilemma, because stuff moves. And I started making a list of things that I would compare this to. For example, Piazza San Marco in Venice is a highly regular, repetitive square with lots of chaotic Venetian fabric around it, not unlike this. And it's not something that looks very Venetian, at least initially. It was an interpretation of a Roman forum, so it arrived from someplace else. I think probably the same could be true for Plaza Mayor in Madrid, which was a Renaissance square that was dropped into Madrid by the Habsburgs. And I think there's a lot of examples throughout history. Covent Garden is another good example of something which was alien, I think, to much of what was going on there. And particularly when you walk through the streets of London and you end up in Covent Garden, it's a very different place. Now, having said that, I love the strategy of making this regular square and formalizing it and giving these people a kind of really beautiful place that's as good as any other place in Buenos Aires, not just some ratty place with the shitty ends of buildings sticking into public space. And I think you're to be commended for taking that on. That said, I think there's a couple things about the architecture I would probably rethink a little bit. One is maybe the mansard is a little bit too much. I could have seen a third floor with a flat roof and it probably would have been just fine and maybe fit in a little bit more. I love the archway over the street. I think that's a nice way to handle a lot of that. I think the one end what is that open outdoor pavilion called again?
Oh, Galpon.
Yeah, I think that works fine. I think the community center, there's a matzo ball that's a little bit too big for the soup, because what it does is it blocks the entry into the square in any kind of nice way there. And I end up wondering, could you have done a kind of version of the Gonfalon on the ground floor? In other words, taken the community center program and pushed it up a floor or maybe made a two-story archway that you walk through that building and wrap the community center around it so that there was a much greater sense of the presence of this space. Now, I said that sometimes, some of the ways you get into Piazza San Marco were kind of informal, and when you end up in there, it's like, wow, this is really cool. So it's not necessarily axial. But I think the side street there, the way this building hits this here, I agree about the church. This corner right here is really unfortunate. If that's a major way in, you really want to rethink that, how that comes in. I think the church probably could enjoy some things. I ended up wondering, would it make some sense if this thing was maybe a little bit more in this direction, and so we could get a little relief on the sides, and so you could get in, make it a little more porous this way, so it had more attachment to this thing. The last thing I'll say is about the proportions of your architecture. I think either these people are too big or this arcade is too short. So when you make your portfolio, just make the people smaller. Because they're almost as, you don't want to be above the spring line of the arch. Like having the spring line of the arch like right about here would probably be okay. Now, Place de Vosges is very low. You might look at that one. That's a low space there. But I think this is a little bit troubling that it's this low. But I think, I think there's a lot of examples through history where you have people who are making their own life in the residential fabric, and then there is some sort of representation of the order and the government and the institutions of society that imposes itself somewhere. And while a lot of people would say today that's a really bad aspect of colonialism, it has yielded some rather remarkable spaces throughout time in the history of cities. And I think I prefer to see your project as aligned with that rather than anything else, because I think there's some real merit to that.
Maybe it's a new style called POCO, post-colonial.
I mean, I fundamentally love the idea of the project, and I love the liner idea. Whether I agree, I don't think stylistically it makes sense to me. Like, and part of it is very similar to the last project where you just gotta, you could print. You have these two sideboards which are like kind of catch-all, right? You don't have to lay it out. Just like pin up a bunch of photographs of the stuff you're looking at, the stuff that's there. I have no idea really what any of this stuff looks like. And so I would want you to be creating something that is trying to rationalize and like as a springboard from the vernacular that's there. That feels like the way to start. But the other part of it is often when I'm working on projects and you get to a point, one of the things that we try to do a lot at our firm is like, are there ways to like edit this or simplify it in a way that gets to the essence of it without like kind of limiting the number of moves or the number of things you have to do. And so to me, the fact that you picked up the galpon and moved it is probably one of the things where like I kind of get it, but I feel like you could probably pick it up and put it back and leave the soccer field where it is. And maybe some of the liner becomes, you use some of that liner to fill in this gap. And so you kind of come through something else and the galpon is here. Right now it's like a gateway, but in fact, before it was a space. You could have tucked the playground under it, or a part of the bleachers could have been under it as shaded. So it just feels like that's like one move. It's like you start the whole project by picking that thing up and moving it. And it just to me, it's like, and I even look at this perspective, it feels like it's too grand for what you're making. And then like the idea that you would get into that space and it would be more kind of enclosed, I think would be better. And then your first comment about the ground plane and the landscape, I feel like there's so many of these like super cool parks that are happening all over the world, like with, like crazy paint colors on the ground or mosaics or things. Like I feel like the experience of being in the plaza right now is a little bit, you just kind of pick some patterns, like, some rendering patterns and like threw them on the ground. And I think you could be much more intentional about the ground plane and the shading and everything, similar to how you spend a lot of time thinking about the architecture, the surface, but the ground plane I think is lacking.
Okay. I want to just add on to that. I think the more I look at this, the more I'm curious to see different explorations of the ground plane, but in terms of grading. How could you, maybe change the grade of the soccer field, because that's like a completely different use, and maybe weave it into the stands at a different grade, so that it's not just like sitting there, but it's kind of part of the built environment, and also the weaving of the canopy, like I mentioned before. But I really think that the grading, just everything being on the same grade, from the covered walkways to all of the green space inside, that there's something there that I'm wanting more.
Thanks. Just a couple of disconnected thoughts, Sergio. I think what is lovely about this project, and also how you've created this central rendering, is that it really asks the question about whether or not what should be in the square for this community. You mentioned that there's a lot of sports around, sports stadiums, et cetera, and I maybe get the sense that they can't play soccer there because they're excluded from playing. But I don't know. I don't know if a soccer field is the right thing for what is to be the square that becomes a special place for the community. I understand what soccer is and what football is in some cultures, to people from warm climates. But I don't know. That was the one thing I just wondered if having open space where people could, families could gather, promenade, do other things other than watch the children play might be more useful. The other thing I would offer, or I thought about, and it makes me wonder, like, this is so much you had to wrestle with, but the scale of the big building, the gym building, versus then a very empty shell, which is what the Galpon is. I wondered if some of that program could have gone over into the Galpon, and maybe the Galpon became a building, rather than having these sort of like really two differences in scale. And then the other thing is that as an entry into this plaza, just having that shell structure, it's kind of boring, and it's not particularly celebratory at all in terms of the arrival experience. I understand you arrive from other pieces, but if this is the thing that begins to define the new look of the neighborhood, just having that sort of roof and shell, I think, is perhaps a bit of a letdown. And I wonder if you could maybe formalize the vending, or maybe add some program into that space, and maybe get down some of the height of the gym building. And then finally, I'm interested in how you wrestle with the other side of the plaza. I think it could be really interesting, and maybe you did study this, and maybe that's where the comment came about your floor to floor feeling very low. But you've got this sort of formal piece, and then the informal, being exposed into the, looking into the courtyard. And I would have loved to have seen that elevation, because I think that contrast could be interesting. That contrast could have been truthful. There's nothing wrong with contrast. It may have actually began to talk a little bit more about this idea of the informal settlements being accepted versus the informal settlement being more of an experience that is a definer. The reality of a different set of economics and a different set of priorities becoming something that can open onto a square. There's one over here. And lastly, you can't skateboard on pervious concrete.
Sergio, like Matt, I also like your project quite a bit, and I want to commend a couple things you've done. The models are great, and the big model and the progression of that. You had everyone gathered around the models, so don't stop making models, and the rest of you students out there, continue to make models. I think your thesis has generated a very nice discussion. The comments I have are related to the comments about kind of culture and history, but more from a tectonic and an experiential point of view. And when you make a liner, the you know, whether it's a mansard roof or a flat roof. So I think all of those are good discussion points. To me, the part of your project that I think is needs a different tack, I would say, is the choice of the big vaulted roof over the big building at the end. If you look at the building in plan, it's wedge shaped. So either each of those trusses are different radius and length, and or they're not, you know, so there's a bunch of kind of technical questions there. But if you look at your perspectives and your elevations, it's really the datum that's made. So, you know, the section under the Galban, everyone's going to experience that frontally from the plazas, but the new one you've made, we're just seeing it from the side, right? And it's kind of it's disintegrated, right, on the court side, so that datum isn't continued. So I would have just said use a hip roof or a gable and not, or flat, yeah, and not cause both kind of tectonic and experiential issues and using that form again at the other end.
Sure, but then I'd like to say something.
Which is that when you get to the civic building, we have to objectify it. And I think that's a problem. And I think what I think in another day and age, what somebody might have done is said, well, let's just continue this across here. Who cares? And we could have the expression of this building above the skyline of a room or a roof piece. But you can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to make this more important by separating it somewhat with the roof from the fabric around it. And I think that's a symptom of a kind of non-urban approach. It's the important building, so let's make it a little bit different and give a little bit of this. But if, right. Well, and so, yeah, we get the shapy roof and stuff, which it doesn't clearly need and stuff. And I think there might have been a strategy whereby the thing was part of the plaza on this side with maybe with your balcony and stuff, but it might have had, the facade could have had some figuration in it that engaged that, and then maybe something else on the other side. I think the building gets better if it's 80% smaller this way because it allows more access around the sides. But I think it is a particular symptom of students when they get to the civic program, you have to objectify it in a way in the plan or in the three-dimensional expression of it, rather than making a facade change and scale the facade to make it seem more important. The other thing that you were saying about the informal side, I'm reminded of, if you've ever been to the Great Plaza in Loreto, Italy, they were going to build the big square in front of the church, but the plague hit or something, and they only got like 2 sides built. And so it's this formal square on one side, but it's all these little houses on the other side. I think that might be perfectly okay here, actually. Yeah, exactly. That's what you made me think of. Yeah.
And Sergio knows that. We talked about it. Look, there's 2 things I want to point out. I think this model is fabulous. And I'm pointing this out because if you are a student in pro-thesis at the moment, I'm talking to the people on TV at the moment. If you're a student in pro-thesis at the moment, and you don't arrive the first day of the semester with a model like this, it makes it really darned hard to crit. So now that this model's here, and this came to us in the last week or 2, I keep wanting to take all of this arcade thing and squeeze the space in a bit, because I'm concerned about the relationship between this and the fabric to the north, which we've kind of glossed over. You know, basically Uncle Franco and Aunt Maria lose their windows as a consequence of the facade, right? The other thing is that, so there is a kind of schizophrenic language here. And it goes back to Adam, to the point that you bring up. And I wasn't challenging you or even accusing you of wishing bad things for poor people. But there is a schizophrenic language here. Is on the one hand, the civic building is rendered in a kind of tectonic that one might imagine the way people might build in this area. In fact, actually, maybe part of the project could be the neighborhood comes in and builds this thing, and there's a scheme for doing it, and everybody's proud of their civic amenity. And then there's this, and I wonder if there's a middle ground between the two, because to me, this is quite harsh. it meets the ground in a rather rough, tough way. The thought about how it meets the sky and so forth. And I also wonder, you know, my colleague over here may beg to differ, but do we really need the arches? I mean, because that's going to be really hard for these folks to build, but maybe there's a way to create a repetition and an order along that facade that has a grandness to it, but it doesn't have to be as indebted to historical reference literally. It could be, and I suggest Auguste Perret's work. I suggest a lot of the work of Michael Dennis, an architect in Boston, that takes historical types and transforms them using contemporary, you know, languages, or extensions of those languages. Instead of speaking ancient Latin, he's speaking modern Italian. So there.
You know, the other thing that's sort of interesting, when somebody asked you, Sergio, you went down and talked to the people and asked them what they wanted, you know, and stuff. That's always an interesting thing, because I think what people in poor neighborhoods want is the access to the same things everybody else has access to. And, you know, I think we can sit here and we can have academic arguments about colonialism and styles of architecture and stuff. And there certainly is some validity to a lot of that. But I also think that when at least in my experience in working with similar groups, not in Argentina, but in the United States, what they want is choice, to be able to have the same quality that other people have. And I guess it probably was a surprise to you that they said that, but I would think that something that would seem as having the same level of quality as they have in other parts of Buenos Aires would be received very well by these folks, because it meant that there would be a certain amount of municipal money involved here. It would mean that the municipality had as much investment in this community as it might have someplace else. I think that's a really important lesson for architects. You know, yes, you can attribute most colonial regimes to all sorts of horrible behavior and stuff, but also, you know, communities change over time, and what was once seen as a Habsburg intervention in Madrid, and it'll never not be that, is also an essential part of the daily life of that city. So these things have a way of kind of evolving over time, which I think are really important lessons for us.
Oh, yeah.
We're transitioning.
Transition. All right. Well, thanks so much, Sergio, and for the comments from the jury today. I think you had a really great discussion, actually. One thing that I don't know if the jurors were aware of, you know, he has a lot of process work over there that I think we changed this like 200 times. The location of the galpon itself, that took like months and months of discussion. At the end, we decided to put it as a kind of a welcome kind of center, or a welcome kind of gateway right into your promenade. This discussion is very interesting. I encourage you now that since you were down there, don't let this thesis end here. Take it over there. Bring it back to the folks, right? The people who needs it to see what you have created. Because they might be astonished with this, right? And maybe they might be interested within Comuna Ocho to maybe, hey, maybe we can start some fundraising and maybe start thinking about building aspects of this, right? Or redevelopment, right? I mean, you're creating a new prototype in which you're avoiding the need of bulldozing informal settlements in Latin America and creating something that, hey, we can salvage these informal settlements, providing spaces for people to live, work, play, right? In which these are people who, as you mentioned, some of them, you know, don't even have a high school degree, right? They can work here. They can actually be employed in your community center, in the new spaces that you're developing around that colonnade, right? All that is part of that kind of financial environment that you're also developing for these folks, right? So it's not just sports and having beautiful spaces, right? It's developing this sense of financial health for these folks as well, right? And in a decent way of living. Right? You know, I'm from Puerto Rico, and we have Spanish, we have American stuff. You know, we're colonized by, you know, both ends, and there are good things for both and bad things in both, right? And we work with them, right? So we can talk about styles, you know, till next year, but I think the spaces in the promenade you're developing here, I think these are spaces that the people in Comuna Ocho and Barrio Fatima will appreciate and enjoy. So see, you can provide even like a Zoom meeting with these folks down there. I'll be happy to, translate and be with you in that sense too. So congratulations on your work. I know you work your butt off. That model was beautiful, by the way. I'm
Thank
taking
you.
it home. And I want to thank you for a really enjoyable year working with you and getting to know you. So I wish you all the best in your career, and congratulations.
So we're going to take another break here. It's going to be about a 10-minute break because we have to turn these panels here for the next review. Thank you very much. That way.
That's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for helping and being a great thesis.
incorporating the precedents as you talk about the design. So I looked at that, manipulate this. They are at this level, but they're not. Okay, folks. Call all of the reviewers back to center court. Good. Okay. So this is the third of 3 morning presentations. Maya's going to take us to Fort Totten in Washington, D.C. And we're going to be looking at a facility that deals with human trafficking and rehabilitation. Maya's committee was Professor Jana Vandergoot was the chair, Professor Dawn Jordan was a committee member, and myself. And thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maya Mule, and this is my thesis research called Designing Sanctuary, and it focuses on trauma-informed design for post-trafficking rehabilitation. So the focus of my thesis is designing and creating healing spaces for human trafficking survivors, facilitating their reintegration back into society. So just as a little background, human trafficking encompasses both labor and sex trafficking, and it's a serious crime all over the world. I'm going to be focusing on human trafficking, specifically human sex trafficking in North America. There have been studies that show that Washington, D.C. reports among the highest trafficking rates in the United States. It's number 4 and number 1 according to number of calls per capita, according to the national hotline. So this is a very urgent issue, and it's very close to where I live, so I felt like it would be a very important topic to study. And most of the survivors are females, so I will be focusing on that specific demographic in my thesis. So just kind of zoning in on for the Fort Totten for my site, I did a hotspot MAPP analysis according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline statistics, and there was a concentration of trafficking cases near the Washington, D.C. area. And zooming in, I found that there is a direct correlation with highways, especially Highway 95, and there were hot spots along that corridor. So I chose Fort Totten in DC as my site because DC is a hotspot, and I had 4 criteria that were really important to the project based on my research. So it was public transportation access. Accessibility is a really big aspect because a lot of survivors do not have cars. Also, connection to nature is really crucial because I am focusing on trauma-informed design, and that is a major aspect of that. And future development and potential housing developments was important to map out. There's a housing and children's museum being developed right across from the site, and it is a new transit-oriented development site that is being developed. Also, there are a lot of resources like Bridges Charter School, bilingual schools, community gardens, and it is also adjacent to the DC Rape Crisis Center. So here's just a snapshot of the topography of the site, and you could see the metro track and how the site is an existing parking lot owned by the metro. Survivors face a lot of challenges, including very harsh stigma, restrictive housing program requirements. Many experience homelessness and inadequate support systems. And so they really require trauma-informed care and trauma-informed housing and emergency centers and long-term housing. So different stages of housing related to different stages of their healing. And going into the stages of healing, based on my research, I came to this conclusion that there are 4 stages of healing, and it's not a one-size-fits-all for everyone, but to get a sense, the first stage is identification and emergency services, which is about 0 to 30 days. The second stage is the stabilization phase. The third is the preparation phase for independence, so long-term support and long-term housing. And then the fifth and the fourth and final is community integration. And there were a lot of case studies about how frameworks really failed in the community integration back into society, and a lot of survivors face stigma. So going into how we could solve this through design, there is a form of design called trauma-informed design. And there was a lot of research by Shopworks architects, and there are kind of these 6 principles of trauma-informed design that I wove through my thesis design. The first one is empowerment and personal control, security, privacy, and personal space, stress management, like places of refuge, sense of community, beauty and meaning. So that could be seen in my project through biophilia and access to the outside, and dignity and self-esteem. So that could that could manifest itself in privacy spaces in my program. And throughout this research process, I have met a lot of inspiring women like Natalie Clayton, who is the president of Fair Girls, and I also collaborated with other anti-human trafficking organizations in the DC area, and interacted with clients at or survivors at a confidential drop-in center to help them with vocational training. My design is based on these precedents and these ideas of the grid and like very, very heavily the safe residential protection precedent. which is this kind of womb-like structure surrounding this courtyard. And going like further into that, I studied shelter-specific architecture. And I found that same theme kind of with this enclosure, this public space enclosed by the outside. So my program really focuses on safe residential protection, holistic recovery, community resilience, individual empowerment, quiet reflection spaces, all woven together with nature connections. And this reflects itself in my partie. As you could see here, there is a kind of like structure kind of embracing this green space and serving as a protected sanctuary space. So I want to walk through my project through the hypothetical lives of those who would occupy these spaces based on the different healing stages. So I have different people that reflect the different stages, like intake. Zara has her own schedule, and she mostly resides in this most protected space called the Nest, and it's this temporary supportive housing space that she would kind of live in for about like, you know, a month or so before she moves to the next stage of housing. Maybe it's apartments in the main healing center building. And she would start out at the intake building, which is at the very tip of the building. The stabilization phase. So in this phase, that would be connected with supportive housing. And so this community member has a daughter named Rosie, and they live in a supportive housing unit, a 2-bedroom supportive housing unit in the main healing center. And they have their own little schedule and routine. And a big part of this thesis was establishing like a routine back into survivors' lives, because structure is really important to those who have had no power in the past. Preparation, so moving up a stage, like 3 to 12 months. Cami lives in a unit that could be an optional co-living unit, and there's a removable partition that connects the 2 units, and which allows collaboration and, you know, building community with your neighbor. And what's special about these units is that they're very customizable, so you could move the glazing on the outside and it leads to this terrace, and then there's this enclosed corridor letting in light and air, and it's kind of this it gives them power back when they adjust their own space. And community integration is the last stage. This is Chai. She lives in a townhouse facing the park, Fort Totten Park. And it's her own space. She owns it. She's been in the community for 12 or more months, and she has her own routine with her service dog, Gracie, and is very involved in the community around her. And I also thought it was important to also think about the staff working at the development. And I have a profile for Mina, and she lives on site in a staff townhome occasionally when she works late nights. And in conclusion, my design really embodies trauma-informed design by allowing survivors to take their power back and have autonomy over their own spaces and also have beautiful views of nature, transparent zones that let in light, but also offer safety and privacy. These greenhouse spaces are on the exterior of the townhomes and on each unit facing the courtyard. So this space of their own kind of allows them to take back and reclaim something that is theirs. Thank you. Yeah. So I'll present with my boards. So on the ground floor, right here, there is a communal dining room. So people could get to know each other and share meals together. Number 20 in the plan is a community kitchen. Maybe staff could make meals sometimes, or there could be cooking demonstrations in there, and that it interacts with that common dining space. And the whole ground floor of the healing center is dedicated to the community that lives there. So it has community spaces like spaces for events, like has a yoga studio, as you could see in the perspective over here, facing the beautiful courtyard on the center. And there are also meeting spaces for survivors who need to meet with maybe a lawyer if they are dealing with legal issues or immigration issues. There are rooms or private meeting pods in that on that ground floor. Yeah.
Okay, so here, I'm going to pass the microphone out here. If we have questions, make sure we ask them in here so our friends back home on Facebook and YouTube can hear us.
I'll start only because I have more questions. Thank you for first in exposing me to this term trauma-informed design. Could you maybe walk me through what might happen on this site? For example, if there is an emergency and a person and their, our persons are brought here, are they arriving via help from an agency or the police department? And then are they checking in building 2? And then is there a need to discreetly then move them to other parts of this building without being seen by others because they're incredibly terrified? And how does the emergency and the onboarding of a new patient happen? And then maybe you can begin to walk us through how then that informs some of your design moves.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I thought a lot about security and safety and
I think so.
yeah, privacy. Yeah. So like this is that intake area. So it's at this end of the site and there's this drop off loop that you could drop off people by car and that's where they would like arrive. I feel like there would be some partnership with nonprofit organizations in the area that kind of, you know, bring people who need to be there
So is that where
to
the
a safe
road?
place. Yeah. Yeah, it kind of like loops around and then it's like a drop off loop. And there's this idea of greenhouse spaces as a barrier, like as a kind barrier instead of a like harsh fence. So like framing the intake drop off, there's a 3-story greenhouse where residents could garden, and it doesn't feel like a barrier, but it does keep people out from the outside out. Yeah. And I'm thinking about the other part of your question about how people move discreetly from one place to the other. So let me think. Yeah, I wanted it to be a very like transitional experience. I didn't want it to be very abrupt. So they would come into intake, and these 2 townhomes here are serve as kind of a staff slash emergency bed for the survivors. So the ground floor would have a bed for the survivors, and the staff would live, or if they need to, would live above. And that kind of would be their first night there. They wouldn't be directly like put in to the or like moved into the temporary supportive housing yet. There's kind of this gradual transition, so it doesn't seem as scary. You're here, and then you've crossed the threshold, and then you sleep there for a night or 2 while preparations are being made, and then you gradually kind of cross this beautiful forest to the temporary units, and you would stay there for like a month or so.
So I have a follow-on question to that. So one is just a comment because you were talking it through, and I think it's interesting. Like, I think there's something very like, to me, the premise makes a lot of sense that you would have people come there, get dropped off, and then they would stay kind of in a kind of tertiary space the first night to get acquainted and not be put into the, with everybody else. So I think that makes sense. I'm a little concerned about the driveway kind of cutting that off. It would seem to me that you'd want people to be able to like then walk from the building into these other rooms or into the garden space without having to come out and cross the driveway again. So that seems a little awkward to me. But my question is the nest. And I immediately saw that. I'm like, what is that? And so it's very interesting to me that it's temporary housing. So please elaborate on why the temporary housing gets this incredible focus in the center of the space.
Yeah. So when people are the most traumatized, they don't really like to be seen as much. And I'm thinking of also the going off of the prospect refuge theory, where you feel protected, but you could still see out. So when you're in the core of the building, you feel the most protected, and you feel the enclosure, but as you walk out, you see more of the surroundings, and it's kind of this like gradual transition to the outside.
I kind of had a similar question to Alex, and
Mhm.
it was, if that's one of the earlier points in your transition through the facility, it strikes me that I understand the desire to provide the protection or kind of quiet area, but it feels like almost those folks are almost on display because they're being centrally placed in within the complex. So I just wonder whether that is the right move or maybe not. But I also wanted to say I really appreciate your precedent studies as part of this, because I really feel like it's complex, you know, configuration of spaces and program, and it's also requires a lot of thought about how to create spaces that accomplish the various types of spaces that each group needs over time.
I think that this thesis asks a question that is asked again and again. Can architecture affect social change? And, you know, can just giving something a label make it do what you want it to do? And I think that like the label trauma-informed design is just another way of saying like good basic architectural principles, you know, autonomy, security, beauty, how to create interaction, community. So I have a lot of questions about that. I think the cause is noble, but in terms of the architecture, I don't like, I have questions. I want to see certain basics. I want to see like north arrows, graphic scales on drawings, plans that are readable. It's very hard to understand plans like the typical, like in these axon diagrams. And then in terms of the floor plans themselves, I don't understand this kind of like glass aquarium wrapper, which extends the space and kind of feels enclosing. And how does that work with the environment of, you know, the weather and the climate in DC? And then the shared spaces, you know, you have these very deep floor plates. And I'm imagining like how it would feel in those spaces. And it doesn't feel like it's reached kind of that level of design. I think that this thesis, it like got a little bit lost in the story, which is of course important, but then the building has to solve the problem, because that's our number one thing is like we have a problem and we have to find a solution. So can you talk about, I guess, the massing and how you came up with this kind of big, like one single loaded corridor, monolithic massing with the glass?
Yeah, I wanted something that would kind of, I feel like long dark corridors could be very traumatizing to people, so I really wanted to push the corridor so it could get natural light, but also kind of celebrate that space as this very interesting greenhouse, like in between area, where you could open up your balcony and kind of let in the fresh air if you want to, or if the weather is nice. I wanted to kind of challenge the typical loaded court. Oh yeah, yeah. This is a townhome. Yeah, it's one of these. One of those facing the park space. So you have your own protected greenhouse space that is your own and that you could customize. And it is kind of tinted a little bit so you have that privacy because it is facing a public courtyard. So I was also experimenting with shading structures on the top that could be adjustable. But I'm thinking of a very open plan for a very customizable space. So you could add curtains or a various shading structures to kind of personalize it, to make it your own. And it creates this garden facade facing the interior space. I mean the exterior space. Yeah. Um, so I really studied um, the transparent spaces of Lacaton Vasal's apartment housing designs, and they had this corridor or like very linear like balcony space that could be enclosed with sliding doors. And it's very customizable, and you could create this extended outdoor space if you want to, like an extension of the living space. Um, yeah, I thought that was really interesting and a way to give power to people and feel like they own their space and they could customize it and they have control over their area.
So I'm intrigued by your exploration of, what do we need from our surroundings and from our architecture at various stages of, in this case, healing. I wonder though if we could have pushed that exploration a little bit further, because what I'm seeing, obviously the nest is very distinct and defined, but the remainder of the stages to me look very similar. And so I wonder if there could have been more differentiation about what people need at each of those steps, whether it's I like what you've done. I like the idea of the access to nature, which is the biophilia that you were chasing. But are there levels, are there more levels that we could have poked into in these steps that you've been looking at? And so whether that's an aspect of time or ability to, it's a semester, you can't design housing for everyone. But it might have been interesting to have a little more differentiation in those stages.
Yeah.
I just want to add one precedent that I think about, and I think you should look at if you haven't already seen it, is Renzo Piano's Rue du Mieux housing in Paris. And kind of like the big move there is that you can get a courtyard building with cross ventilation and open or as close as you want with multiple cores, many multiple cores. Because you obviously don't have a budget. And this way you get all of that, and you don't have to kind of create like a cage of glass or something like that.
Yeah.
You can create much more, you have a lot more freedom in the design. And that's something that's also done a lot in other countries is multiple cores in middle and upper density multifamily housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think piggybacking on the last two comments, I think the thing to me that I think it's the kind of glass house, the greenhouse that's like, it feels very monotonous and it doesn't feel resolved in a way that reflects, the direction of the sun and, things like that. So one idea that I have is like, does it really need to connect all the way around, particularly where the townhouses are? Could the townhouses not have it? Could they have their own kind of smaller version of it that doesn't need to be 2 or 3 stories tall and connect to the other building? And then particularly on the sides, like the kind of south, if you look at the north, north area over there, I'm kind of imagining that this surface right here is just absolutely getting beat by the sun from the south and southwest. And so could that have louvers on it? And then the other part I started thinking about is like, I get that long corridor or long dark corridors can be kind of scary, but also I think long, just kind of continuous monotonous corridors can be a little strange, and those are very long. So I could imagine, what if there were small little like community spaces or things like that that kind of added some solidity to that. So you had like little boxes or whatever of like community-based program or shared spaces on each level that could kind of stagger or something, some way of punctuating those surfaces with something else to kind of break up the kind of 200, 300 foot long corridors that you've created.
Yeah, I really like that idea, and I was starting to kind of explore that. if I had time, I would definitely explore that more. But I started kind of carving out these spaces or punctures in this transitional green space corridor area, like at the pivot of the building. Mhm.
Could
Oh.
be a community space, conference room, meeting space that like punctures the glass and like sits on the courtyard side?
Oh, okay. That would be really interesting to explore. Yeah.
Maya, I guess I'll just, this project to me seems a lot about two themes, you know, one of privacy and then one of hope of transition. On the privacy part, and it might have a lot to do with the how well you presented, you know, the need to be here. Residents, people in the program, people with assistance need to be here. You know, how critical the first month is, the first 3 months are, and then ultimately transitioning to 1 year and the post 1 year support. But I go back to the beginning where privacy is really important and the intake, and there's a volume, a structure, number 2, which is the intake piece of the project, and then the nest, which is, you know, way in the courtyard, and really wanted to, I just feel like there should be there was an opportunity to make a connection, say, perhaps between those two. Basically, once I get into the protection of this facility, I know, especially within my first night and within my first, you know, week, that I am in a zone where I don't have to interact with others where I don't trust them yet. And it might be, and I, you know, it's maybe, you know, with the rest of the housing sort of surrounding the site, you know, that, and it's, you know, many different heights, and it gets into more light and hope and all of that. But I think, you know, a covered driveway, and then, you know, it's a hard thing to sort of figure out. But I think once I get out of that car and I'm into the building that receives me, then I believe the experience should be that I am able to feel safe and whisked away into whatever experiences that the nest is, and not sort of have to transition and be seen by a whole bunch of people.
So just a question, besides the glazing, what did you have in mind for materials, and how did you arrive at your architectural expression?
I really liked the kind of wood facade look. It could be aluminum veneer or kind of something mimicking wood. There were a lot of precedents like next door that had this natural wood feel to it, but it was very durable for the climate. So I was thinking that the facade would kind of have that biophilic vibe, but also the durability, and having the base be this lighter stone as this continuous material that wraps around and kind of ties the other buildings together.
So is your structure concrete or mass timber?
Yeah,
or-
the structure on the yeah, the structure is mass timber, and the parking garage is concrete. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi. So really nice work overall. I was happy to be on the committee as well. My name is Naomi Sachs. And first, I disagree about the idea that trauma-informed design is just good design. It's actually using so it's based on the idea of evidence-based design, which uses the best available evidence and literature to inform design. So, you know, there's a lot of good design out there that doesn't use the same tenets and principles as evidence-based and trauma-informed design. And then for something a little bit more constructive criticism, I agree with folks who've pointed out the nest, and I go back and forth, but I think that there's something that could be a little fishbowl-y about it. And I wonder whether, I also agree that the intake, you know, having that be so far from the nest is, and separated by this road is problematic. And, you know, maybe people stay first in one of these spaces. And then maybe the nest is like where all of the community events, not events, but programming happens. Like dining and the kitchen and yoga, so that that really becomes part of the garden as the community space. And then I agree that the glass, I understand the idea that it's supposed to bring more transparency, but I do think that as privacy is so important, and with the climate in DC, it may be a little much. I'm also thinking about birds that tend to fly into glass and the symbolism of that, as well as the practicality.
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the population. You used your avatars, but you didn't tell us who this group is and how old they are. And I think a lot of the decisions you made were based on a very particularized population. I'd like you to also talk about how you selected this site, because this is kind of a hard to house group in some ways. It brings up the NIMBY issue and planning. So you made some very strategic decisions to make a nest in a very urbanized area. And I also wondered if you could talk about, you know, you focused on the site and we're focusing on the architecture of the site, but you situated this next to schools and other opportunities for integration in the community. So I wonder if you might want to take a few minutes to give some of the more information that the committee was privy to.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to elaborate more about the site selection. Oh, the people. Yeah, the people first. So the survivors, like demographic wise, are very diverse. They come from all parts of the world, so it's very important to be, you know, culturally sensitive through design. Um, they are the targeted population for this community is minors to those in their late 20s. So young adults to teens, I would say. And there would be plenty of mentorship opportunities for the younger populations, and they would be paired with a mentor, and it would be kind of like this big sister relationship, and they would learn how to cook and you know, make a friendship. So I was thinking about mentorship as a healing tool as well. But a very, very diverse population. They are not all English speaking. So I feel like that's really important to consider. And there are spaces in the program for survivors to meet with translators. There's office spaces and flexible meeting spaces on the ground floor, so they could get the support that they need. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the site selection was deeply rooted in the idea that they would kind of be familiar over time with the community that they're in, and they would be partnered, or nonprofits would be partnered with this this building, and um, they would kind of bridge the gap slowly, um, and make the transition less harsh. Um, and they would be focused inward at first, and then it kind of radiates outwards. Um, the inward design was intentional, and then the townhomes were intentionally faced towards the street to kind of give um, a little like transition into an urban setting. And I thought that this was better um, for the last stage, the integration stage, rather than having a completely isolated um, facility close to no resources and close to no metro. Um, I really thought metro access was very important to kind of access the site and find the site if you need help. Um, so that was my reasoning behind the site. And I also really loved the access to the park, Fort Totten Park, and the community garden next to the school. Um, I thought it would be interesting to explore um, the thesis there.
Maya, you got a beautifully drawn thesis. In particular, two of the drawings, the axon, the big axon on the top and the section perspective on the bottom, they really help us to understand the project and some of the big decisions that you made, which I think a lot of them are right on. I think you've gotten a lot of good feedback on, how you handled the glazing and the single loaded corridors. I like the massing quite a bit. I understand that the taller bars to the south where there's adjacent high development, I think you could have explored flipping that so that you get more light and daylight into the courtyard. I think the comments about the nest have been right on. I agree with the last commenter and Alex's early comment. Until I read the labels, I thought, oh, that's got to be a place where people come together and not get kind of a spotlight shown on them, kind of literally and figuratively as they're entering this community to build a better life. And it's quite literally a nested double courtyard. And so I want to bring up more perceptual ideas about architecture when you do something like that. I understand that the courtyard is protected and has a degree of security. I think back to Jane Jacobs and Kitty Genovese. But by creating a double nest, even, you can see it in the section perspective, by creating a double nest, you're not aware of everyone that's in the courtyard when you're in that forecourt. There's people behind the nest and there's people within the nest. And so I just wonder about that, the idea of security and the form of having this double courtyard rather than letting that figural piece be resolved in some other way. But the drawings help us to have a great conversation about it, which I applaud.
Thank you.
I actually wanted to commend you as well on the project. I think there's a great elegance and a great amount of intention in the project, which maybe hasn't been resolved as much as it should be, or it could be. I find the translation of abstract concept into architecture is always a difficult issue, and it's something which I think you need to do. And I I'm imagining La Catana Basal, which is not glazing, and as your model is showing, it's all polycarbonate.
Yeah.
And so the difference to me between polycarbonate and glass is quite large, because there's more insulating properties. They could have different degrees of solar protection. I mean, there's a lot in there, but that's not really on the drawings. I mean, so I think there would be really great to have a section through a la Arcatan, La Catana Basal, like through that space, so that it would be easier to understand for those who maybe don't imagine that architecture. Then also I would say the tectonics, where you have a building which is institutional, but it's masquerading as a home, or it's a home which is also institutional. And I like the fact that the townhouses, which face to the street, read as townhouses with their individual roofs, with their individual fenestration, and yet they're at the same time connected with this membrane. So I think, to me, the metaphor of the connecting membrane, which in green, like you cannot see any of the columns, you can't see any of the sort of structure of that. And that's why I got up and I looked closer, and I think there's a tectonic response, which I kind of expected Peter to comment on, because I think the tectonics of that piece are what would make the project richer, and how you open it, and how you put plants in it, and how you occupy it. And there's a great video. There was an exhibition of La Catana Basal that I saw, of videos of people in those spaces, and how they've they were large screen images, videos of like in slow motion, or in, just amazing how people use those spaces. So I think that's, I think what the jurors or the other members here are looking for. Finally, I think the sophisticated play of levels in the interior, in the courtyard, hide the nest. And so the nest is, a hobbit house, or a bunker, and so I think your intention is that it is hidden in the way that, which actually I think Peter is right, because maybe it's disturbing that, look, wait, there's somebody else over there and I can't see them. On the other hand, I think they're protected. So I'll believe that, because I like the way it's shown, and I'll believe that, because then also the way it's protected. And also, I think it's really interesting the way the entrance pavilion and the nest both have the same green roofs with this overhang. And I think your intention there is that there's a direct relationship between the nest and entering the whole complex, which deserves promenade architectural to get from one to the other, which I think some of the other jurors have commented on as well. So anyway, I think it's a very commendable exercise, and I think you've done a lot of work.
Just a quick comment, because I know Ariel's been waiting. So I just want to confirm that we're reading the plan correctly, like with the residential units. The glass continues as a corridor. It's a corridor, right? It's not individual to the unit. It's continuous. There's no partitions between the corridor.
Oh, yeah, it's a double layer, and I do intend to use polycarbonate, or the greenhouse material you would technically see, as that.
In the
Yeah,
subject,
I
can we circulate through that glass,
I'm on.
or it's two layers?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Because just to build on what Adam and others have mentioned, is that, oh, I thought I was, sorry. Okay. La Catana Basal actually has these extensions to the courtyard, to the units, as you know, but they're actually public facing. They're out to the street, right? You have them turned into the street. And so I think it could be an interesting experiment to think how you could have more privacy in those glass spaces and still create openness to the courtyard. And then, as Peter and others were suggesting, to treat that facade in terms of bioclimatic design, which would also give you more variety, maybe more movement, animation.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Maya. I wanted to pick up on this question since Peter mentioned Jane Jacobs. So we know from certain evidence that eyes and visual attention yields security or safety. But we know from other populations that it feels like surveillance. And so in the spirit of trauma-informed design, I'm wondering what the evidence says and what you've learned from your research over the last year with this community and with the population about the balance between that and where is sort of being centered or protected, right? Like what is the right siting and planning and sort of philosophy around the presence and being in people's visual fields, and how do people feel safe and secure as opposed to surveilled or threatened, and then how does that translate into your design?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was grappling that a lot with that a lot during my design process. I was trying to find a balance of refuge places where those who feel overstimulated could kind of reside, or more quiet spaces. I worked into the program, like the quieter community spaces would be higher from the ground plane, the community area. But from my research with trauma-informed design, places of refuge resulted in more of a positive effect on your mental health. So I tried to find that balance between spaces where you don't feel constantly watched, like inside of the nest, or in your private unit, or on maybe like the mezzanine floor, where you're raised and feel more protected. Yeah, I felt like I was seeing refuge spaces as a positive more than a negative through the design based on my research. But that is a good point. I guess it depends on the person. Like everyone's not the same, you know. I feel like everyone's trauma is different, so it's kind of hard to design for, you know, every individual. But yeah, I tried to take a stab at that. The balance is probably something I would like to investigate more. Yeah.
All right, I think maybe I get the last word. I love how this conversation seems like it's been zeroing in on what probably is the most important topic, right? Which is, how do you create privacy and security without making the survivors feel like they're in jail, right? Or solitary confinement with no light and connection to nature. So I think I'm super excited because I feel like just the design of this space is like maybe another thesis project. I think you have the bones of something good, right? While on first glance, this may seem really exposed and fish bowly, if we know Lacaton Vassell's architecture, we know that as soon as people come in, there are all sorts of layers, like floor to ceiling drapes and you know, landscape, right? And so what I think you've done both for the apartments, but also even at the intake, is to create multiple layers, almost like clothing, right? Not close it off or occlude it, not put kind of a security gate, but say, hey, if we have 4 layers of this sort of semi-public all the way to public space that can be modified by the users, that can have solar screening, that can have, you know, all sorts of things, that will create refuge and privacy. And it will also be something that, you know, the people who live there can modify if they want to sort of have prospect, right? So there's this subtlety there. And I think the role of the greenhouse, let's call it the greenhouse, is different here than it is here, like at the public dining space, versus here at the intake where you really do, you really shouldn't be able to see through that, right?
Yeah, it would be more tinted there.
Yeah.
Or like foggy glass, tinted glass, yeah.
Yeah. So I think you've got the bones of some really sophisticated thinking as an answer to that question. Like, how do you really respond to the premise of trauma-informed design? And clearly there's room to keep working. I think the comments about the nest were really great, right? I can't imagine that as sort of a public space. I can also imagine it as like a bunker in the most private sort of subterranean space. So I think, I could see you for your portfolio continuing to riff on that and think through that. Last, I'll just say, I first met Maya on Zoom during the pandemic. I was a reviewer on one of your undergrad studio projects, and I think you put something in the chat and you said, can you meet afterwards? Do you have time? I wasn't your professor. I didn't have time, but I was like, sure. And you gave me the gift of letting me look at your project a little bit more closely and give you comments. It felt generous, even though you were asking me for something, it felt generous. And then we tracked through, you were in my 601 studio, you were my research assistant, and now Thesis. And I would say, I think that spirit of being generous is here. What you've done is you've given us the gift to talk about this topic, right? You've worked really hard to create a ton of drawings and to deeply engage the people who are affected by this, and you're bringing it here. So thank you for that generosity.
Yes, thank you.
And I want to thank all the reviewers this morning and all the students that presented. For the reviewers, we have lunch, and the faculty have lunch upstairs in the conference room. To the students that are presenting this afternoon, please get the space ready for the reviews to begin again at 1 p.m. So have about an hour to get things ready. Thank you.